I don't know how to open this. So today we have a bit of a project. I'm going to be replacing this utility table with something a little bit sturdier, something that doesn't, creak quite as much, something that looks a little nicer. Maybe I could shoot some B-roll, or if I'm doing a top-down shot of some product reviews, shows a little bit better. And what I've decided to use for that is butcher's block. And butcher's block can be purchased. It's intended to be used as countertops in kitchens. So like every local hardware store has butcher block countertops in stock. You can just go buy it. You don't have to, it's not a special order thing. And so, I kind of wanted that sort of barnwood, aged wood look to the countertop. And in researching how do you achieve that look, I came across this process known as wood pickling. It's basically where you take vinegar and you take steel wool, you mix the two together, let it sit for about 48 hours. The steel wool dissolves in the vinegar, and then when you put the vinegar on the wood, it sort of rusts the surface of the wood. I kind of want to show you some of the experiments that I ran in order to get the color that I liked. Now, this guy, birch block countertop, picked up at the local hardware store, is about 120 bucks. This will be our actual desktop, but the local hardware store also sells a backsplash for it. And so this is only about $20, also made out of the same birch material that the butcher block countertop is made out of, but it makes a great scrap piece of wood that you can try different pickling solutions on until you get the color that you like. Oxidization plays the biggest role in getting these darker colors. If you expose the solution to air, or if you expose the steel wool to air while it's dissolving in the vinegar, it'll turn real brown. If you do less of that, it'll stay gray. And then this was sort of my final test batch. It's sort of that gray color that I ultimately ended up going with. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to prepare our solution. And to do that, you're gonna wanna start with sort of a glass canning jar like this, and some just white distilled vinegar. You wanna buy enough in order to fill the jar. And then you get your actual steel wool itself. Now, this is grade quadruple zero steel wool. I'm gonna use 2 pads of the steel wool here, and you might just kind of open them up like this to just get more surface area. Remember, the more surface area of the steel wool that you can get interacting with the vinegar, the more potent your solution is going to be. Then we'll go ahead and push that down, and because I'm going for more of a gray look, I don't want any of the steel wool to be exposed to the air at all. So we'll go ahead, push it all the way down, and then we'll take our distilled vinegar. Okay, and then just to be safe, to make sure that the steel wool doesn't float up to the surface, because as it sort of interacts with the vinegar, it's going to be giving off some gas, and that can kind of bring up the steel wool to the surface, which again, could cause it to oxidize. I'm just going to put this jar right on top like that. One thing you want to make sure that you do not put a lid, or if you're putting something on top of here to push down the steel wool, make sure it doesn't form a seal, because again, as that vinegar interacts with the steel wool, it'll put off some gas into the water, and it'll actually cause the jar to break, and then you'll have a really nasty mess on your hands if this jar were to shatter. Now that the solution's been prepared, I'm gonna go ahead and set this aside for about 48 hours. It's like Friday afternoon right now. Okay, we're back. It's now Sunday afternoon, so it's been about 48 hours. You can see this is what our solution looks like after sitting for that amount of time. It really doesn't look like it changed color that much, and that's because I haven't let any oxygen interact with the steel wool, so it hasn't really rusted. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna strain out any of the steel wool particles that maybe are sort of still floating in the solution, and we'll just use like a coffee filter and pour out of this and into that. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So we've strained out all of the vinegar solution, and the next thing I'm gonna do is hop outside and go ahead and apply this to my tabletop. We'll start by removing the packaging that the butcher block came in. And once that's removed, we'll take a wet rag that's been soaked with just water, and we'll wet down the surface of the butcher's block. And that's because we want the wood grain to swell up, because we're gonna be using a water-based stain. Once that dries, you're gonna feel the surface is very rough. Go ahead and sand it smooth. I'm using some 320 grit extra fine sandpaper here, and that seemed to work really well. Once the surface has been cleaned, we're gonna go ahead and apply our vinegar solution. Here I'm just using an old paintbrush, and you wanna make sure that you really work the solution into the wood until the wood is visibly wet. But you also wanna make sure that you don't use too much, because if there's any kind of standing water, if the wood gets too saturated, then you're gonna get some splotching. So really just the minimum amount until the wood is visibly wet, and no more than that. In fact, after I made sure I had good coverage of the wood, I came through with just a dry rag and wiped off any excess water. Once your stain application dries, you want to come back through and sand it again because, again, the wood grain will have swelled up, so it's going to feel real rough. Using 320 grit sandpaper again, just go ahead and sand it until smooth. Now we're ready to apply our finish. I'm just using some dead flat varnish that I picked up off Amazon, linked down in the description below. I'm using this because I don't want there to be any kind of sheen or any reflection because, like I said, I might use this table for some, B-roll or some product photography. And I'm just using a small paint roller and rolling it into the surface of the table. Again, you want to make sure you get good coverage. You want to make sure there aren't any streaks. You kind of want to smooth out the surface so there aren't any visible lines. Now you want to let that dry for a couple hours or whatever the bottle recommends, and then come back in and sand it again using your 320 grit extra fine sandpaper. It got too dark to shoot any more video on it, but I ended up doing 2 more applications of the varnish and then sand it after each coat. So after letting the desktop dry overnight, I decided to mount it to a motorized standing desk. And I went with one from Uplift. This is their V2 standing desk frame in their metallic color. So here I am using a speed square in order to mark some holes in order to space the desk an even distance from the edge on each side. And now we'll attach the control box, and it's nice because the desk is actually so short that I didn't have to use the extension cable, so you can see that the cabling is very tidy. I also got these optional casters that came as an accessory and got some help from a couple little helpers, and so here's the finished product. I think it turned out absolutely wonderful. I love the color. I think that technique of putting the jar on top of the steel wool in order to hold it down and prevent it from interacting with the air at all helped keep the sort of the browns out of the color that we got. It's a very nice gray. It also didn't turn out splotchy at all. I think that technique of just applying a very thin coat, make sure that the wood is wet, and then using a dry rag in order to remove any excess water really helped with any sort of unevenness in the color. To my eye, it looks absolutely fantastic. I hope you found this video helpful. I'll be hanging out down in the comments section. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.